Dear friend, today in this session, we are going to look in the broad area, conservation of biodiversity, basic approach. As you know, it is a part of our course MSD012 Ecosystem and Natural Resources. In this session, we are going to touch upon why we need to conserve biodiversity in a brief, and what are the basic approaches to biodiversity conservation and major challenges in meeting goals of biodiversity conservation. We know that the basic uses and importance of biodiversity are, if I summarize a simple language, whatever you have seen here, it gives us goods or provisioning services in the form of food, in the form of food, etc. And it also gives us cultural services, and basic importance is it gives ecological services by supporting and regulating different services to give ecological health, a good ecological health. We also learn in the same time that the loss of biodiversity due to human activities that have been occur more rapidly in the past 50 years, and we have discussed about this thing in several sessions in this course. And you can look at this rapidly, that the way it is losing in the last 50 years, it's very high as compared to at any time in the human history before. So as a result of this loss of biodiversity, and we know the use of biodiversity, then due to this loss, it has impact on the productivity of most of the ecosystem, and declining the productivity of the ecosystem. The supply of various goods and services provided by nature is also getting hampered. This calls for global and national attention to save biodiversity further decline and to adopt various conservation practices. When you talk about conservation of biodiversity, what does it mean? Conservation of biodiversity means the management of human use of biosphere so that it may give maximum benefit to the present generation while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspiration of the future generation. It's talking about sustainability, right? The major aims of the conservation of biodiversity are at conserving the diversity at all the levels, including genetic, species, and ecosystems. Includes promoting sustainable use of all its components, including plants, animal, microorganisms. Protecting natural habitats from degradation and fragmentation is also an important part of biodiversity conservation program. So this conservation of biodiversity also provides, for fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arises from the use of bioresources and associated traditional knowledge. If you look worldwide, a number of international, regional and national levels programs are being carried out to ensure conservation of biodiversity and to check its further depletion. Convention of Biological Diversity is one of the key agreements adopted at the Earth Summit in 1992 that simply aims at conserving rich biodiversity of the planet. So the main important point what we need to understand is that since we know that biodiversity includes all living communities and their attributes, understanding of basic principle of biology and ecology is very crucial for the management or conservation of biodiversity. So we need to understand different approaches to biodiversity conservation. And that's why that conservation biology, which is evolved with the main purpose of conserving the biodiversity, has become one of the mature discipline in the mid-20th centuries is, ecologists, naturalists, and other scientists, they began to collectively research and address issues pertaining to global declines in biodiversity. In fact, conservation biology includes principles, guidelines, and tools for the purpose of protecting biodiversity. This conservation biology is a crisis-oriented and multidisciplinary subject. We can say that it is multidisciplinary, that includes biology, ecology, social organization, education, and many other disciplines. In conservation biology, we'll see the conservation ethics advocates management of natural resources for the purpose of sustaining this biodiversity in a species, ecosystem, and the evolutionary process in the human culture and society. When you talk about extinction, in response to the extinction crisis, the research of conservation biologists is being organized into strategic plans that include principles, guidelines, and tools for the purpose of protecting biodiversity. So in this way, when in the process of understanding, learning, and when we have shown that conservation biology is one of the important tools in achieving biodiversity conservation. So you can see two basic strategies of biodiversity conservation. One is in situ conservation strategies, the other is action to conservation strategies. In situ conservation strategy, the conservation of biological diversity is done in their natural habitats through protection of total ecosystem. While in case of action to conservation, the conservation of biodiversity happen at or done at place away from their natural habitat. And we realize, it has also been realized when you talk about in situ conservation strategy that when we preserve the habitat, and reintroducing eliminated indigenous species is one of the more effective to conserve biodiversity in general. Because when we talk about conservation, biological conservation, we know that something is wrong is happening. Right, so that's why we preserve the habitat. Once the preservation of the remaining native species in an area is assured, then we can do reintroduction of those species can be attempted. Sometime in that process, we'll find out missing species. Those missing species can be identified from the databases such as, Encyclopedia of Life, and Global Biodiversity Information Facilities, IUCN Red List, and so many from the data bank. On the other hand, invasive alien species is one of the threat to biodiversity, natural plant or natural habitat. So, preventing entry of invasive alien species and managing them in situation of their unintentional or accidental introduction, it will help in preserving native biodiversity, natural habitat. So these exotic species that have become a pest can also be identified taxonomically. For example, looking into some of the digitally automated identification system like the barcode of life, which we have managed for the research. Other measures contributing to the preservation of biodiversity include, the reduction of pesticide use or switching to organic pesticide. And you must have heard about biodiversity banking. Biodiversity banking is also another approach which involves placing a monetary value on biodiversity so that its values are realized in economic terms. One of the example is, Australian Native Vegetation Management Framework, and how ecological we are looking into biodiversity assessments and economic evaluation of biodiversity. So when you talk about this in situ conservation, it refers to the conservation of biological diversity in their natural habitats through the protection of the total ecosystem. So the area which provide protection to the biological diversity in their place or natural habitat can be categorized as protected areas, biosphere reserve, sacred forest, and sacred lakes. And one from conservation of agricultural biodiversity in case of that human managed ecosystem or human managed biodiversity. And what is protected areas? These protected areas are areas of land and or sea specially dedicated to the protection and maintenance of biodiversity and are managed through legal or other effective means. Some of the examples of protected areas are, it's very common to you, national parks and wildlife sanctuary. The major benefits we're getting from protected areas are, it maintains viable population of all native species and subspecies. It maintains the genetic and distribution of communities and habitats and conserve the genetic diversity of all the present species, prevent man-made introduction of exotic species. And what are national parks and sanctuaries? National park, it is an area which is strictly reserved for the welfare of wildlife and where activities such as forestry, grazing or cultivation are not allowed. And mention may be made here that in earliest time is Yellowstone National Park in USA, and one is Royal near Sydney, Australia. They were chosen of their scenic beauty and recreational values. In India, Jim Corbett National Park, that is near Nainital, is the first national park which was established in India. In the same time, sanctuaries is an area which is reserved for the conservation of animals only. Here in this sanctuary, the operations such as harvesting of timber, collection of minor forest product, and private ownership rights are allowed provided they do not affect the animal adversely. The second category under in situ conservation is Biosphere reserve, which was, you must have heard about, Men in the Biosphere program of UNESCO, which was formulated in 1975. It is one of the concept of that Men in the Biosphere program. Men in the Biosphere program, which was formulated by UNESCO in the year 1975, deals with the conservation of ecosystem genetic resources that contained therein. These biosphere reserves are a special category of protected areas of land or coastal environment wherein people are integral component of the ecosystem. Yet you have to note down that these are a special category of protected areas of land or coastal environment wherein people are an integral component of the ecosystem or of the system. So in biosphere reserve, it consists of three major zones. One is core, second one buffer, and transition zone. In core zone, as it is also known as natural zone, it comprises an undisturbed and legally protected ecosystem. But under the another zone next to core zone, if you're coming towards the settlement, that's called buffer zone. In that zone, this buffer zone surround a core area and is managed to accommodate a greater variety of resources, use strategies, and research and educational activities. The outermost zone, and it's called a transition zone of that biosphere reserve, it serves as an area of active cooperation between reserve management and local people. Wherein here, in this transition zone, activities like settlement, forestry, recreation, and other economic uses continue in harmony with conservation goals. This biosphere reserve performs three important roles. One is conservation, that ensures the conservation of landscape, ecosystem, species, genetic resources. Second one is development. It promotes culturally, socially, and ecologically sustainable development. The third one is scientific research, monitoring, and education. It provides support for research monitoring, education, information exchange related to local, national, and global issues of conservation and development. The third category is, which is very common, especially in India, the concept of sacred forests and sacred lakes. You will see a number of traditional practices in India, not only in India and other Asian countries. We maintain sacred forests and lakes to protect biodiversity. And basically, if you look into those areas, you will find out sacred forests and lakes that is protected by, especially by tribal communities, because the tribal communities, they have, I know you will see that that particular places where they assume they worship as a sacred forest or lake, because that area have religious sanctity, and that is part and parcel which grown with their own civilization. Okay, so in India, like in most part of northeastern India, Meghalaya, Assam, Manipur, and then Arunachal Pradesh, now you will find out a number of sacred forests, sacred trees over there, even in parts of Karnataka, Maharashtra, Kerala. So these sacred areas, natural area, it may be forests or lakes, they are serving as protective center for a number of rare, endangered, endemic taxa. In the same way, like sacred forests, aquatic flora and fauna are also protected in sacred water. Like for example, that Ketchiopalri lake in Sikkim, that has been declared by the people of that area, and India, they said, you will see the aquatic life, because of sacredness of that area, and the degradation of aquatic life is easily safe because of their attachment and because of their religious sanctity, which they attach with that natural area. The fourth one, when we are talking about biodiversity, we cannot avoid that agricultural biodiversity. When you talk about agricultural biodiversity, it's a managed ecosystem. So on-farm conservation of agricultural biodiversity is also one of the approach towards conservation of biodiversity. We know that agrobiodiversity refers to the variety and the variability of living organisms that contribute to food production system and associated activities. And we also know that, and it is also evident that in the past few decades, intensification and the homogenization of agroecosystem that have led to significant losses in agrobiodiversity, including the loss of crop and livestock species, genetic diversity, as well as crop-associated biodiversity. So, there is a need of conserving this agrobiodiversity, and that should be taken place in urgent priority at different level. It may be national or international level. So, in situ on-farm conservation, agrobiodiversity is the major approach towards this end. It also encourages this on-farm and conservation agricultural biodiversity, also encourages sustenance of rich biodiversity in the agricultural farms. And we know that agrobiodiversity has severely declined in most of the modern agricultural farms. In the same time, we will find out there are many communities that still practice traditional agriculture in which they grow great variety of crops in their region. Such communities are largely confined to remote areas, especially in hilly regions, tribal areas in India. And in the past few decades, not only in that area, we have evident that farmers in certain states have also adopted methods of organic farming in which they have paid attention to conserve agrobiodiversity. So, in situ conservation on-farm conservation of agrobiodiversity also contributes in improving the livelihood of farmers, particularly in resource-poor areas. Right? It not only, conserve the agrobiodiversity, it's also improve the livelihood. The second strategies, the major strategies to conservation of biodiversity is ex-situ conservation strategy. We know that ex-situ refers to the conservation of biodiversity at place away from their natural habitat. So, for ex-situ conservation of biodiversity, like germplasm or gene banks are established. That includes botanical garden, zoos, genetic resource center, seed tissue culture, DNA bank. Then you have seen seed gene banks. The best way is seed gene bank. This is the easiest way to store germplasm at ultra low temperature. That's sometimes that storing germplasm at ultra low temperature, that is at around temperature minus 197 degrees centigrade liquid nitrogen, is called cryopreservation. This cryopreservation it's a kind of germplasm. It can be stored for a long period of time. In the case of what we are talking about, gene banks are collection of specimen and genetic material. You will see some of the banks intend to reintroduce bank species to the ecosystem via tree nurseries. So gene banks, germplasm banks, cryopreservation, they play an important role in conserving biodiversity. The important thing we need to understand is, as compared to in situ conservation, ex situ conservation requires larger geographical area to establish, but we need more sophisticated management. So when ex situ conservation of biodiversity, it's very highly significant because of certain region. Two of the basic reasons is, one is the conservation of wild varieties of plant or crops and culture of microorganisms provide as a source of genetic material. Second one is, plants and animals conserved in botanical gardens, zoos and aquaria can be used to restore degraded land, reintroduce those species into the wildlife, and restock depleted population in the wild. So you will see that as it's a very common, we know that botanical gardens, zoos are the most common places for the conservation of biodiversity. You will see all over the world there are more than 1,500 botanical gardens which contains more than 80,000 species of plants. Many of these botanical gardens have seed banks, tissue culture facilities, and other ex situ technologies. What are the major challenges in meeting goals of biodiversity conservation? Whenever we are trying to get something to implementing something, of course there will be some challenges. So some of the major challenges in meeting goals of biodiversity conservation are, when we are trying to regulating the large-scale deforestation, land use changes, while meeting the growing demand of expansion of agriculture, roads, railway tracks, mining factories, powerhouse, river dams, urban residential schemes. These are some of the challenges. We have to go and we have to do this also. The other is, meeting the increasing demand of for biological resources caused by the population growth and that increased consumption. That is also one of the challenges. Then it's very difficult to control the increasing pollution levels and global warming. This is also important challenges. At the same time, you will see that increasing our capacity to document and understand biodiversity, its value and threat to it. It's not an easy task. So we need proper documentation. And in some way, building adequate expertise and experience in biodiversity planning, then improving policies, legislation, guidelines and fiscal measures for regulating the use of biodiversity, adopting incentives to promote more sustainable forms of biodiversity use, promoting trade rules and practices that foster sustainable use of biodiversity. Then one of those challenges is, strengthening coordination within government and between government and stakeholders, securing adequate financial resources for conservation, sustainable use from both national and international sources, to use or making use of the better technology practice, whether we will be able to use that effectively or not is also one of the concern or one of the challenges in achieving biodiversity conservation. Then building political support for the changes necessary to ensure biodiversity conservation and sustainable usage. So it's very difficult to build a political will to achieve biodiversity conservation, that improving education and public awareness about the value of biodiversity, this is also not an easy task. So the point is, if you see in this diagram, this summarize what are the approaches to strategies of biodiversity conservation in situ and ex situ. You'll be able to understand from here. So in this session, what we learned that there are two basic approach strategies to biodiversity conservation or conservation of biological diversity. One is in situ, another is ex situ conservation. So with this, I'm sure we will be able to understand what are the basic concepts of different approaches of biodiversity conservation. Thank you very much. And these are some of the references which you need to I depend on for this presentation. And also I suggest you can further refer all these references for your personal use. Thank you very much. Thank you.